picture a charming English village festival where laughter and clinking wine glasses fill the air, until a single sip turns deadly. When Thomas Wren collapses, poisoned at St. Mary's Mead's Wine Festival, suspicion falls on a proud vintner, a guarded sommelier, and a bitter rival. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and sharp eyes, can unravel a web of envy, secrets, and betrayal. As whispers of cyanide and revenge swirl, will she uncover the truth before the village's heart is broken again? Dive into the Poisoned Wine Festival, a mystery where every glass holds a clue, and no one is quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The festival begins. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting a golden glow across the meadow where the annual wine festival had transformed the quiet village into a hub of festivity. Trestle tables draped in white linen lined the field, each adorned with bottles of ruby and amber wines, their labels gleaming with promise. The air carried the sweet tang of grapes and the hum of anticipation. As villagers and visitors alike mingled, their voices rising in a cheerful cacophony. At the edge of the meadow, near the vicarage's ancient yew tree, Miss Jane Marple sat on a weathered bench, her knitting a soft rhythm against the clamour. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, took in every detail. The flutter of a woman's scarf, the too-quick smile of a merchant, the way the crowd parted for certain figures. She had attended every festival for decades, and though she delighted in the tradition, she knew villages held secrets beneath their merriment. The festival was St. Mary's Mead's pride, a celebration of the county's vineyards, drawing connoisseurs and locals alike. This year, the spotlight fell on Mr. Clarence Duval, a vintner whose Pinot Noir had won accolades far beyond the village. His stall, positioned at the meadow's heart, was a magnet for the crowd, its bottles arranged like jewels under a striped canopy. Duval himself, a robust man with a florid complexion and a booming laugh, poured samples with theatrical flair, his pride evident in every gesture. Beside him stood Miss Evelyn Hart, the sommelier, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her movements precise as she described each wine's bouquet and vintage. Her knowledge was formidable, though Miss Marple noted a certain brittleness in her smile, as if she carried a private burden. Among the throng was Mr. Thomas Wren, a merchant whose wealth was matched only by his penchant for gossip. His loud voice carried over the crowd as he sampled wines, offering unsolicited opinions with a wave of his glass. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, noting the way others edged away, their politeness strained. Then there was Mr. Victor Slade, a rival vintner hovering at the periphery. His once thriving winery had faded, and his presence at the festival seemed more obligation than celebration. Miss Marple observed his thin frame and the tight line of his mouth, his eyes fixed on Duval's stall with an intensity that spoke of envy, or perhaps something darker. As the grand tasting began, the crowd gathered around Duval's stall, glasses raised in a toast to the season's bounty. Miss Marple, too far to hear the speeches, watched the interplay of faces. Duval's confidence, Evelyn's practiced charm, Wren's boisterous cheer, and Slade's shadowed withdrawal. The first sips were met with murmurs of approval, but the harmony shattered in an instant. A strangled cry cut through the air, sharp and terrible. Thomas Wren staggered, his glass slipping from his hand to shatter on the grass. His face contorted in agony. He clutched his throat, gasped and collapsed, his body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. The meadow fell silent, the crowd frozen in horror. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through, kneeling beside Wren. His fingers sought a pulse, but his expression darkened. "Dead," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that chilled the air. "Poison, I'd wager." Whispers erupted, eyes darting to the spilled wine, its crimson stain seeping into the earth. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled, her mind already turning. Murder, she thought, had gate-crashed the festival, and its shadow would not easily lift. She rose, her frail figure unassuming, and moved closer to the scene, her eyes missing nothing. The broken glass, the faint bitter scent in the air, the way Evelyn Hart's hands trembled as she stepped back, the flicker of fear in Duval's eyes, and Slade's sudden absence from the crowd. All were threads in a tapestry she would soon unravel. St. Mary's Mead, for all its charm, was no stranger to human folly, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the festival's sparkle lay a motive waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the meadow, so recently alive with the clink of glasses and the murmur of laughter, now lay under a pall of shock. The autumn sun, though still bright, seemed to cast a colder light on the scene where Thomas Wren's body lay, covered hastily with a tablecloth from a nearby stall. The crowd had been herded back by Constable Reed, whose boyish face betrayed his unease at the task. A cordon of rope, hastily strung between wooden stakes, encircled the area around Clarence Duval's wine stall, where the tragedy had unfolded. Miss Jane Marple, standing just beyond the rope, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, observed the chaos with her usual quiet intensity. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, darted from face to face, noting the whispers, the sidelong glances, and the subtle shifts in posture that spoke louder than words. Murder, she knew, had a way of peeling back the veneer of civility, revealing the raw edges of human nature. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly, his motor car crunching over the gravel path that bordered the meadow. A tall man with a brisk manner and a notebook perpetually in hand, he was no stranger to St. Mary's Mead or to Miss Marple's uncanny knack for unravelling mysteries. He nodded to her briefly, a gesture of respect, before turning his attention to the scene. Dr. Haydock, still kneeling beside Wren's body, was murmuring to a young assistant who scribbled notes with a trembling hand. The doctor rose as Craddock approached, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "Cyanide. I'd stake my reputation on it, Doctor," Haydock said, his voice low but firm. "The symptoms, convulsions, the gasping, the faint almond-like smell, are unmistakable. Death was near instantaneous. The poison was in the wine he drank, no doubt about it." Craddock's brow furrowed. "The wine? You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without a post-mortem," Haydock replied. "The glass he dropped is there, shattered, but the residue should tell us more." "I've sent for the coroner," Miss Marple, standing just within earshot, noted the broken glass, its fragments glinting in the grass like cruel stars. The wine had spilled, a dark stain spreading into the earth, carrying with it that faint bitter scent Dr. Haydock had mentioned. She stepped closer, her small frame unobtrusive, and bent slightly to examine the shards. The crowd, now a restless knot of onlookers, whispered theories. Some spoke of tainted bottles, others of personal grudges. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Gossip, she knew, was a village's lifeblood, but it was often muddied with half-truths. She preferred facts, and the facts here were stark. Thomas Wren had drunk from a glass poured at Duval's stall, and now he was dead. Craddock, after a brief consultation with Dr. Haydock, began his interviews. He called first for Clarence Duval, the vintner, who stood near his stall, his florid face now pale with shock. Duval's hands, usually so steady when pouring wine, trembled as he adjusted his tie. "Inspector," he said, his voice hoarse, "this is a calamity. My wine, my reputation, it's unthinkable that anyone could tamper with it." Craddock's pencil scratched across his notebook. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mr. Duval." "From the moment you opened the bottles for the tasting." Duval mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "I brought the bottles myself this morning from my cellar. They were sealed, as always, with my own wax stamp. I opened them just before the tasting. Miss Hart assisted, of course. She poured the glasses, handed them out. Wren was one of the first. He took a sip, made some crude remark about the bouquet, and then Duval's voice broke. He fell. I saw nothing amiss, nothing at all." Miss Marple, listening quietly, noted the emphasis Duval placed on the sealed bottles. A man so proud of his craft would be meticulous, she thought, but pride could blind one to small details. She recalled the layout of the stall. A long table, bottles lined up, corks freshly pulled, and glasses waiting to be filled. Could someone have slipped past Duval's watchful eye? Next, Craddock summoned Evelyn Hart, the sommelier, who approached with a measured grace that belied the pallor of her cheeks. Her auburn hair was still neatly pinned, but her eyes, usually bright with confidence, were shadowed. "Miss Hart," Craddock began, "you poured the wine for Mr. Wren. Did you notice anything unusual? The bottle, the glass, his behaviour?" Evelyn's hands clasped tightly before her. "Nothing, Inspector." I poured from the bottle Mr. Duval opened. "The Pinot Noir, it's his finest vintage." I checked the glasses myself. They were clean, freshly washed. Mr. Wren was himself. Loud, a bit rude. He complained the wine was overrated before he drank. Then he collapsed. Her voice faltered, and she looked away toward the cordoned-off area. Miss Marple watched Evelyn closely, noting the faint tremor in her fingers. The young woman's composure was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, as if one sharp question might crack the facade. Had she seen something she wasn't telling? Or was it simply the shock of witnessing death so close? Finally, Craddock sought Victor Slade, the rival vintner, but the man was nowhere to be found. A villager, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, piped up from the crowd. "He was here earlier, Inspector, skulking about near Duval's stall. I saw him myself, just before the tasting." Her tone carried the relish of one who thrived on village intrigue. Craddock made a note, his expression darkening. Miss Marple, however, recalled Slade's thin frame and bitter eyes from earlier in the day. His absence now was telling, though whether it spoke of guilt or mere cowardice, she could not yet say. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "This is a nasty business, Miss Marple. Poison in a public setting. It's bold, deliberate, but why Wren? And how did the poison get into his glass? The bottle was opened on the spot, and Miss Hart swears the glasses were clean." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained grave. "It is curious, Inspector. A festival is a place of chaos, with many hands and eyes. Yet poison requires precision. I wonder, was the wine itself the target, or was Mr. Wren?" She paused, her mind already sifting through possibilities. You might look at the table where the glasses stood before they were poured. A moment's distraction could be enough, Craddock nodded, accustomed to her cryptic hints. He directed Constable Reed to collect the remaining glasses and the bottle from which Wren's wine had been poured. The bottle, half empty, bore Duval's distinctive wax seal, now broken. The constable handled it gingerly, wrapping it in cloth for the laboratory. Miss Marple watched, her thoughts turning to the mechanics of the crime. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock had said. Fast-acting, odourless in small doses, but deadly. It could be slipped into a glass in an instant, but who had that instant, and why? As the crowd began to disperse, shepherded by the vicar and his wife, Miss Marple lingered near the stall. The table where the glasses had stood was cluttered with corks, napkins, and a small bowl of almonds. Ironic, given the scent Dr. Haydock had mentioned. She bent closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. A faint stickiness caught her attention. A residue not unlike spilled wine, but with a sharper edge to its smell. She straightened, her mind racing. Had the poison been in the glass before the wine was poured, or had it been added in the act of serving? And what of the bottle itself? Duval's insistence on its integrity was convincing, but Miss Marple knew that even the proudest men could overlook a sleight of hand. She turned her attention to the crowd, now thinning as dusk settled over the meadow. The festival had been halted, the stalls abandoned, their wares left to gather dew. Yet the faces she had observed earlier lingered in her memory. Duval's indignation, Evelyn's guarded calm, Slade's absence. Each had a role in this drama, she was certain, but the script was still hidden. She thought of her niece's garden parties, where a careless word or a fleeting glance could reveal so much. People, she mused, were much the same whether sipping tea or wine, prone to envy, to pride, to secrets they thought well hidden. Craddock approached again, his notebook now filled with hurried scrawls. "I've sent for Slade," he said. "He can't have gone far. And I'll have the laboratory test the bottle and the glass fragments. But Miss Marple, this feels personal. Wren wasn't a popular man from what I hear. Do you know anything about him?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Only what the village says, Inspector. Mr. Wren was wealthy, loud, and not always kind. He had a way of making enemies, as such men do. But whether his death was the goal, or merely a means to another end, I cannot yet say." She paused, her eyes scanning the meadow. "You might ask about the rivalries here, not just between vintners, but between ambitions. Festivals bring out both the best and the worst in people." Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're right, of course. This could be about more than one man's death. Duval's reputation is at stake, and that's no small thing in a place like this. If his wine is tainted, he's ruined." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Victor Slade. His failing winery, his bitter glances. Envy was a powerful poison, and not always administered through a glass. Yet Evelyn Hart's trembling hands and Duval's nervous bluster could not be dismissed. Each had been close to the fatal moment. Each had opportunity. The question was motive, and that, Miss Marple knew, would require patience to uncover. As the inspector moved off to issue orders, Miss Marple returned to her bench, retrieving her knitting from its bag. The needles resumed their steady rhythm. A counterpoint to the turmoil in her mind, she thought of the village chemist Mr. Pye, who stocked all manner of substances, and of Mrs. Price's gossip about Slade's movements. She thought, too, of Evelyn's expertise with wine, her access to the glasses, and Duval's pride in his untouchable bottles. The pieces were there, scattered like the shards of Wren's glass, waiting to be fitted together. The meadow grew quiet, the last stragglers drifting toward the village under a sky now streaked with purple. Miss Marple rose, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, and made her way home. The festival had ended in tragedy, but the truth, she was certain, would not remain hidden for long. In St. Mary's Mead, as in all villages, secrets had a way of rising to the surface, like bubbles in a glass of fine wine. Chapter 3. The Vintner's Pride. The morning after the tragedy at the wine festival, St. Mary's Mead wore a subdued air, as if the village itself mourned the loss of its festive spirit. The meadow, now empty of stalls and laughter, lay quiet under a sky heavy with clouds. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked along the lane toward Clarence Duval's vineyard, her steps measured but purposeful. She carried a small basket, ostensibly filled with homemade preserves as a gesture of condolence, but her true intent was to observe the man at the heart of the festival's calamity. Murder, she knew, often left its traces in the smallest details. A glance, a hesitation, a word left unsaid, and she meant to find them. Duval's estate, perched on a gentle hill just beyond the village, was a testament to his success. Rows of vines stretched in orderly lines, their leaves tinged with the first blush of autumn. The house itself was grand, with ivy-clad walls and tall windows that caught the morning light. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the meticulous care of the grounds, a reflection of Duval's pride in his craft. Yet there was a tension in the air, as if the vineyard itself sensed the shadow cast by Wren's death. Duval welcomed her at the door, his florid face creased with strain. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice attempting warmth, but betraying fatigue. "How kind of you to call. This is a dark time for us all." He ushered her into a sitting room, adorned with trophies and framed certificates, each proclaiming the excellence of his wine. A decanter of ruby liquid sat on a sideboard, untouched, as if even Duval hesitated to pour, after yesterday's horror, over tea, served by a nervous maid who darted glances at her employer. Miss Marple steered the conversation gently toward the festival. "Such a tragedy," she murmured, her eyes soft with sympathy. "Your wine, Mr. Duval, has always been the pride of St. Mary's Mead. It must be dreadful to think someone could tamper with it." Duval's face reddened, though whether from anger or distress, Miss Marple could not yet tell. "Tamper? Impossible," he declared, setting his cup down with a clink. "My bottles are sealed with my own wax stamp, prepared under my supervision. I've spent 30 years building my reputation, Miss Marple. No one could breach my process without my knowledge." His voice carried the fervour of a man defending his life's work. But Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a biscuit. She nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Of course, you are so meticulous. But tell me, how are the bottles prepared for the festival? It must be quite an undertaking." Duval leaned back, warming to the subject. "It's a precise operation," he said. "The bottles are selected from my cellar. Only the finest vintages, mind you." I inspect each one myself, ensure the seals are intact. They're transported in locked crates to the meadow, and I open them just before the tasting. Miss Hart, the sommelier, assists with the pouring, but I oversee every step. No one else touches the wine Miss Marple's needles, which she had retrieved from her basket, clicked softly as she listened. His account was thorough, yet she sensed a gap, a moment where vigilance might have faltered. "And the crates?" she asked, her tone mild. "Are they ever left unattended? During the bustle of the festival, perhaps?" Duval hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the window. "Well, briefly, perhaps, while we set up the stall. But the meadow is crowded, and my staff are always nearby. Besides, the seals would show any tampering." His voice grew firm again, as if convincing himself as much as her. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over his words. A crowded meadow offered cover for a quick hand, and a sealed bottle, while secure, was not impregnable. She recalled the village blacksmith's son, young Tom, who had once boasted of opening a locked box without a key. Human ingenuity, she knew, could outwit even the proudest precautions. Her thoughts were interrupted by Duval's sudden shift in tone. "If you want to know who had cause to ruin me," he said, leaning forward, "look to Victor Slade. His winery's been failing for years, ever since I surpassed him in the county tastings. He's bitter, Miss Marple, bitter to the core. I've heard him snipe about my success, calling it undeserved. He was there yesterday, skulking about. I wouldn't put it past him to try something desperate." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained gentle. "Mr. Slade does seem troubled," she agreed, "but to poison a glass of wine, that would be a bold act, even for a rival. And poor Mr. Wren caught in the middle. Did you know him well?" Duval's expression soured. "Well enough. He was a loudmouth, always poking his nose into others' business. He bought a plot of land I'd had my eye on last year, then tried to lecture me on viticulture, as if he knew a grape from a gooseberry." He shook his head, but his indignation seemed tempered by unease. "Still, I'd no reason to wish him dead." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his words. Duval's rivalry with Slade was clear, but his mention of Wren's land deal piqued her interest. Property disputes, she knew from village life, could stir deep resentments, and Duval's insistence on the sanctity of his bottles, while vehement, left room for doubt. Had he truly watched every moment, or had pride blinded him to a lapse? As she rose to leave, thanking Duval for his hospitality, she paused by a framed photograph on the mantel. A younger Duval, beaming beside a barrel, his arm around a man who bore a striking resemblance to Victor Slade. "An old friend?" she asked lightly. Duval's face tightened. "Slade, years ago, before he turned sour. We trained together, you know, in Bordeaux, but that's ancient history." He turned away, signalling the end of the conversation. Miss Marple made her way back to the village, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The vineyard's beauty lingered in her mind, but so did Duval's nervous tick, and his quick deflection of blame toward Slade. Pride, she reflected, was a double-edged sword. It drove men to greatness, but could also shield them from their own vulnerabilities. She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, whose pride in her rose garden had once led her to overlook a blight until it was too late. Duval's confidence in his process was admirable, but no system was flawless, especially in the chaos of a festival. Back in St. Mary's Mead, She paused at the post office to collect her mail, knowing it would offer a chance to glean village gossip. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was predictably eager to share. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" she said, her eyes bright with a thrill of scandal. "They're saying it was cyanide, slipped right into Mr. Wren's glass. And Mr. Duval, so proud of his wine. Imagine the shame. I saw Victor Slade near the stall, you know, just before it happened. He had a look about him. Like a man with a grudge, Miss Marple smiled faintly, encouraging the flow of information. Did you now? And what was he doing, Mrs. Price?" "Hovering, that's what," Mrs. Price replied, leaning over the counter. "He had something in his hand. A small bottle, I thought, though it might have been cologne. But now I wonder," her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, "he's never forgiven Mr. Duval for outshining him. And Mr. Wren, always stirring trouble. Why, I heard he mocked Slade's wine at the pub last week." Miss Marple thanked her, tucking the tidbit away. Slade's presence near the stall, the mysterious bottle, these were threads to be woven into the larger pattern. But she cautioned herself against haste. Gossip, while useful, was often embroidered with exaggeration. She needed facts, and those would come from careful observation and the right questions. As she walked home, the village clock chiming noon, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Duval's vineyard. The locked crates, the wax seals, the crowded meadow, all suggested a crime of opportunity, yet one requiring precision. Cyanide was not a casual weapon. It demanded intent and access. Duval's pride might have made him careless, but it did not make him a murderer. Slade's bitterness, however, was a darker thread, one that warranted closer scrutiny. She settled into her armchair by the window. Her knitting resumed, and considered her next step. Evelyn Hart, the sommelier, had been at the heart of the tasting, her hands on the glasses, and Slade, elusive and resentful, could not be ignored. The festival's tragedy was a puzzle, its pieces scattered among pride, envy, and ambition. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a rhythm to match her thoughts. In St. Mary's Mead, as in all villages, the truth lay hidden in the ordinary, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. Chapter 4. The Sommelier's Secret. The morning mist still clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary's Mead. As Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village hall, her sturdy shoes tapping softly on the path. The hall, a squat stone building with a steeply pitched roof, was a hub of village activity, and today it hosted a wine seminar organized by Evelyn Hart. The sommelier, whose poised demeanor at the festival had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. The tragedy of Thomas Wren's death had cast a shadow over the village, but life, as it so often did, pressed on. Miss Marple carried her knitting bag, its contents a comforting pretext for her visit, though her true purpose was to probe the edges of Evelyn's story. In her experience, those who appeared most composed often guarded the deepest secrets. The hall was abuzz with preparations when she arrived. Long tables were draped in white, set with rows of glasses that caught the light like prisms. Evelyn Hart stood at the front, arranging bottles with a precision that spoke of her expertise. Her auburn hair was swept into a tight chignon, and her tailored dress lent her an air of authority, though Miss Marple noted the faint lines of strain around her eyes. The sommelier glanced up as Miss Marple entered, her smile quick but guarded. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice smooth as the wines she described. I thought the seminar might lift the village's spirits after everything." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair near the front, her knitting needles already in hand. "It's a credit to you, Miss Hart, to carry on so bravely. Such a dreadful business at the festival." Her tone was gentle, inviting confidence, and she watched Evelyn's reaction closely. Evelyn's smile faltered, but she recovered swiftly. "Dreadful, yes, poor Mr. Wren. I still can't believe it happened." She busied herself with a bottle, her fingers lingering on its label. "I hope the seminar will show the village that wine can still bring joy, not tragedy." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. "You have such a gift for it, my dear. I saw you at the festival, guiding everyone so expertly. You must have been terribly busy, preparing the glasses, pouring the wine." She paused, her eyes soft but searching. "It's a wonder you noticed anything at all with so many people about." Evelyn's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, a movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. "It was busy," she admitted, her voice measured. "But I'm trained to notice details. The clarity of the wine, the shape of the glass. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, I assure you." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Of course you would." "But Mr. Wren, he was quite particular, wasn't he? I heard him comment on the wine's bouquet just before. She let the sentence hang, watching Evelyn's face. Evelyn's lips tightened, though her tone remained even. "He was tiresome, if I may say so. Always making a fuss. He said the Pinot Noir lacked depth, which was nonsense. Mr. Duval's vintage is exceptional, but I paid him no mind. I poured his glass, handed it to him, and that was that." She turned away, adjusting a row of glasses with unnecessary care. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind sifting through Evelyn's words. The sommelier's composure was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, like fine crystal under strain. She recalled seeing Evelyn at the festival, moving swiftly between bottles and glasses, her eyes scanning the crowd. Had she been watching for someone? Or something? "You must have been near the table where the glasses stood," Miss Marple said lightly. "I noticed it was quite crowded, with bottles and corks and such. Easy for something to be overlooked." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward her, a spark of unease in their depths. "I checked the glasses myself," she said quickly. "They were clean, freshly washed. I'm very particular about that. And the bottle? Mr. Duval opened it himself. There was no opportunity for anything to go wrong." Her voice carried a note of defensiveness, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the glass she held. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "You're so professional." "But it must be difficult managing such an event. And I understand you've had quite a journey to get here. Your certification, I mean. It can't have been easy." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained. "It wasn't," she admitted. "The courses were expensive, and I've had to work hard to make a name for myself. But I love what I do. Wine is an art, Miss Marple. It's worth the struggle." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the village gossip she'd overheard at the post office. Mrs. Price had mentioned Evelyn's debts, a whisper that had spread like wildfire. A young woman with ambition, burdened by financial strain, might be tempted to take risks, or to cover for someone who did. "You've done wonderfully," Miss Marple said, "though it must be trying with all of the talk now about the festival. People can be so unkind." Evelyn's jaw tightened, and she set the glass down with a faint clink. "They can," she said shortly, "but I've nothing to hide." "I poured the wine, that's all. Whatever happened to Mr. Wren, it wasn't my doing." She turned to greet a group of villagers entering the hall, her smile returning as if a curtain had been drawn. Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts weaving a delicate pattern. Evelyn's expertise gave her access to every detail of the tasting, from the bottles to the glasses. Her quick denial of any irregularity was convincing, yet that fleeting moment of unease suggested something unspoken. Was it fear of suspicion, or something more? Miss Marple thought of her niece's friend Clara, who had once hidden a financial scrape behind a dazzling smile. People, she mused, often concealed their troubles under a veneer of competence. The seminar began, and Evelyn's voice filled the hall, describing the notes of a Chardonnay with a passion that captivated her audience. Miss Marple listened, her knitting a steady counterpoint, but her attention was on the sommelier's movements, the way she handled each bottle, the care she took with each pour. It was the mark of a professional, but also of someone who knew how easily a moment's distraction could be exploited. Had Evelyn been distracted at the festival, or had she seen something she dared not mention? As the seminar drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help clear the glasses, a pretext to stay close. Evelyn accepted with a polite nod, and as they worked side by side, Miss Marple ventured another gentle probe. "It must be difficult for Mr. Duval," she said, "with all this suspicion on his wine. You work so closely with him. Do you think he's holding up?" Evelyn hesitated, her hands pausing over a tray of glasses. "He's upset, naturally," she said. "His wine is his life. But he's strong. He'll weather this." Her tone was careful, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something. Concern, perhaps, or loyalty. "And Mr. Slade?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as soft as her knitting. "I hear he and Mr. Duval have a history. It must make things awkward with him at the festival." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "Victor Slade is a bitter man," she said, her voice low. "He's never forgiven Mr. Duval for surpassing him, but I don't know him well. He keeps to himself." She turned away, her movements brisk, signalling the end of the topic. Miss Marple thanked her and left the hall, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The village was stirring now, with children playing in the square and shopkeepers sweeping their steps. Paused by the churchyard, her thoughts turning over Evelyn's words and silences. The sommelier's poise was a shield, but shields could hide as much as they protected. Financial strain, proximity to the crime, a quickness to defend Duval. These were threads in the tapestry, but not yet the full picture. As she walked home, Miss Marple recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary's Mead, when a young governess had hidden her brother's theft behind a facade of impeccable manners. Evelyn Hart was no thief, but her guardedness suggested a burden. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the weight of being caught in a scandal? And what of Slade, whose bitterness seemed to grow sharper with each account? The village clock chimed, marking the hour, and Miss Marple's steps quickened. She would need to speak with others, perhaps Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for gossip rivaled Mrs. Price's, or the chemist, Mr. Pye, who might know more about cyanide's availability. The festival's tragedy was a knot of motives and opportunities, and Miss Marple's patient hands were already unravelling its strands. In St. Mary's Mead, secrets, like fine wines, needed only time to reveal their true character. Chapter 5. The Victim's Shadow. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned armchair, her knitting bag at her side. The soft click of her needles blending with the clink of teacups. Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a penchant for gossip and a heart as warm as her hearth, was in her element, regaling Miss Marple with tales of the village's latest stirrings. The tragedy at the wine festival had set tongues wagging, and Mrs. Bantry, ever attuned to St. Mary's Mead's pulse, was eager to share what she knew. Miss Marple, with her gentle nods and occasional murmurs, encouraged the flow, knowing that gossip, when sifted carefully, could yield grains of truth. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," Mrs. Bantry began, setting down her scone with a flourish. "Thomas Wren, of all people, not that he was a saint, mind you. The man had a tongue sharp enough to cut glass, but poison at the festival. It's like something out of one of those dreadful novels." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with intrigue, and poor Mr. Duval, his wine ruined. Though I dare say he's not the only one with a motive. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Mr. Wren was not well liked, then?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. In a village like St. Mary's Mead, a man like Wren, wealthy, outspoken, and meddlesome, rarely passed unnoticed. "Not liked at all," Mrs. Bantry declared, buttering another scone with vigour. "He was a merchant, you know. Made his fortune in textiles or some such thing. Moved here 3 years ago. Bought that big house on the hill. Always throwing his weight around, telling people how to run their affairs. Why, he had the nerve to tell Colonel Bantry his roses were pruned wrong. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling her own encounters with Wren's booming voice at village events. "He did seem forceful," she said, "but had he crossed anyone in particular? Someone who might have wished him harm?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. "Oh, plenty. Take Mr. Duval, for instance. Wren bought a plot of land last year, right next to Duval's vineyard. Wanted to start his own winery, if you can believe it. He told anyone who'd listen that Duval's methods were outdated, that he'd show him how it's done. Duval was furious, said Wren knew nothing about viticulture and was just throwing money around to make trouble." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind filing away the detail. A land dispute, especially one tied to Duval's livelihood, was no small matter. "And Mr. Duval took it badly," she prompted. "Badly. He was livid," Mrs. Bantry said. "I saw them at the pub last month, arguing fit to burst. Wren called Duval's wine passable at best, and Duval nearly threw a glass at him. If looks could kill, Jane, Wren would have been dead then and there." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Duval's pride, so evident during her visit to his vineyard. A man so invested in his reputation might resent such public slights, but enough to poison a glass. She needed more, and others. Mr. Wren seemed to have a talent for making enemies. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, there's Victor Slade, of course. Wren was no kinder to him. At the harvest fair last year, Wren tasted Slade's Merlot and called it vinegar fit for pickling. right to his face. Slade went white as a sheet, and I heard he smashed a bottle in his shed later that day. His winery's been struggling, you know, and Wren's taunts didn't help. If anyone had reason to hate him, it Slade Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. Slade's bitterness, already a thread in her tapestry, grew sharper with each account. A failing winery, public humiliation, motives were piling up like leaves in autumn. "And Miss Hart?" she asked, her tone as light as her knitting. "Did Mr. Wren ever cross her?" Mrs. Bantry chuckled, reaching for the teapot. "Oh, Evelyn Hart. She's too polished to let it show, but Wren got under her skin too. At a tasting last spring, he called her a glorified barmaid with airs. Said her talk of bouquets and vintages was all pretension. I was there, Jane. She didn't flinch, but her eyes could have cut steel. She's worked hard for her place, you know, and Wren made it sound like a parlour trick." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the new threads. Evelyn's composure at the festival and her guardedness during their talk at the village hall took on new weight. A woman with ambition, stung by such insults, might harbour resentment, though Miss Marple doubted it was enough for murder. Still, Evelyn's proximity to the fatal glass could not be ignored. "He does seem to have had a gift for offence," she murmured, "but poison is so deliberate. I wonder if his death was the aim, or if he was simply in the way." Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. "In the way? You mean someone meant to ruin the festival itself? Duval's wine, perhaps?" She paused, her scone halfway to her mouth. "That's a thought, Jane. If the wine was tainted, Duval's reputation would be in tatters. And who'd benefit? Slade, perhaps, or someone else with a grudge." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the festival's chaos. The crowded stall, the open bottles, the glasses waiting to be filled. A public spectacle like Wren's collapse would cast suspicion on Duval's wine, regardless of the true target. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary's Mead, when a farmer's prize cow had been poisoned, not for hatred of the cow, but to discredit its owner. Motives, she knew, were rarely as simple as they seemed. She sipped her tea, steering the conversation to lighter matters to keep Mrs. Bantry at ease. "You've been so helpful, Dolly," she said. "It's a comfort to know the village has you to keep its story straight. But tell me, was Mr. Wren close to anyone? Friends, perhaps, who might know more?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Friends? Hardly. He was a widower, no children. Kept to himself mostly, except when he was stirring trouble. Though I heard he was thick with Mr. Pye, the chemist, for a time. Something about investing in a new shop. But that was ages ago, and I don't know if it came to anything." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained unchanged. The chemist, Mr. Pye, had access to substances like cyanide, and a business dealing with Wren could hold clues. "Mr. Pye," she said thoughtfully, "such a quiet man. I must call on him soon. My garden could use some of his advice on pests." Mrs. Bantry laughed, oblivious to the undercurrent of Miss Marple's words. "Oh, Jane, you and your garden, always fussing over those roses. But do be careful, poking about in this business. Poison's no trifling matter." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she gathered her things. "I'm only an old woman with too much time, Dolly," she said, her eyes twinkling. But as she left Mrs. Bantry's cosy drawing-room and stepped into the crisp afternoon, her mind was far from idle. Thomas Wren's shadow loomed large, his quarrels with Duval, Slade, and Evelyn, painting a picture of a man who courted enmity with ease. Yet the poison in his glass suggested a purpose beyond personal spite. Was Wren the target, or a means to a greater end? Duval's ruin, perhaps, or the festival's disgrace? She walked slowly toward the village square, her thoughts turning to the chemist's shop. Mr. Pye, with his bottles of powders and liquids, might hold a piece of the puzzle. And Slade, with his wounded pride, remained a figure of interest, his absence at the festival's critical moment a question mark. Evelyn's guardedness, too, lingered in her mind, a thread that might lead to unexpected places. As she passed the church, its spire piercing the gathering clouds, Miss Marple recalled a village girl, years ago, who had hidden her anger behind a quiet smile until it spilled over in a petty theft. People, she mused, were much the same, their hurts and hatred simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. The festival's tragedy was such a spark, and Miss Marple's patient hands were already unravelling its threads, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Rival's Motive. The lane to Victor Slade's cottage wound through the outskirts of St. Mary's Mead, where the village's tidy charm gave way to overgrown hedges and crumbling stone walls. Miss Jane Marple walked with her usual unhurried gait, her shawl drawn against the late afternoon chill, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The sky was a patchwork of grey clouds, promising rain, and the air carried the earthy scent of damp leaves. Slade's home, a modest dwelling dwarfed by the grandeur of Clarence Duval's estate, seemed to mirror its owner's fortunes, faded, neglected, yet stubbornly enduring. Miss Marple's purpose was clear: to gauge the man whose bitterness had been whispered about in every corner of the village since Thomas Wren's death. Envy, she knew, could fester like a wound, and Slade's rivalry with Duval made him a figure worth studying. The cottage door creaked open at her knock, revealing Victor Slade, his lean frame stooped, his eyes wary beneath a shock of greying hair. His shirt was rumpled, his hands stained with earth, as if he'd been tending his garden. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "to what do I owe the visit?" He stepped aside, gesturing her into a parlour cluttered with books and bottles, the air heavy with the musty scent of old paper and neglected wood. Miss Marple smiled, her manner disarming. "I was passing by, Mr. Slade, and thought to offer my sympathies. The festival was such a shock for us all, and I know you and Mr. Duval have long been part of its tradition." She settled into a worn armchair, her knitting needles emerging almost by reflex, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the tension in the room. Slade's lips tightened at the mention of Duval. "Sympathies, is it? I suppose the village is buzzing with talk of poison and blame. Well, I had no part in it, if that's what you're here for." His tone was defensive, but his eyes darted to a side table, where a half-empty bottle of his own Merlot stood, its label faded. "Oh, I'm sure no one thinks that," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, though her eyes missed nothing. The nervous twitch of his fingers, the way he avoided her gaze. "But it must be difficult seeing Mr. Duval's success so celebrated. I hear you two were once close in your Bordeaux days." Slade's expression darkened, and he sank into a chair opposite her, his hands gripping the armrests. "Close? That's a generous word for it. We trained together, yes, but Duval always had to be the best. He undercut me, charmed the buyers, took the prizes. My winery was thriving until he came along with his flashy vintages and his grand estate. His voice grew sharp, edged with years of resentment. Now I'm scraping by while he's the toast of the county. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. It must be hard, she said, to see your work overshadowed. And Mr. Wren, I hear, wasn't kind about your wines either. She watched him closely, noting the way his jaw clenched at Wren's name. Wren, Slade spat, his eyes narrowing, a loudmouth with more money than taste. He invested in Duval's vineyard, you know, instead of mine. Said my Merlot was fit for the drain. I'd have words with him, but poison? That's not my way. His voice trembled, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, anger, yes, but also fear. Of course not, she said, her tone gentle but probing. But you were at the festival, weren't you? Near Mr. Duval's stall, perhaps. It was such a busy day, with so many people milling about. Slade's hands stilled, and he looked away, toward the window where the first drops of rain pattered against the glass. I was there, he admitted, his voice low. At the cider stall mostly. I didn't go near Duval's wine. Why would I? I've no interest in his glory. But his words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers twisted together, betraying unease. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft but searching. The cider stall? How sensible. It was so crowded near the wine tasting, wasn't it? I saw you earlier, I think, near the edge of the meadow. You must have a keen eye to avoid the crush. Slade's gaze snapped back to her, a spark of alarm in his eyes. You saw me? I was just passing through, checking the stalls, that's all. He stood abruptly, crossing to the side table to pour himself a glass of water, though his hand shook slightly. I don't know what you're getting at, Miss Marple, but I've nothing to hide. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over his reaction. His alibi was vague, and Mrs. Price's gossip about a vial in his hand lingered like a shadow. She changed tack, her voice as mild as ever. Your garden is lovely, Mr. Slade. I noticed your roses as I came in. They must take a great deal of care. Slade relaxed slightly, grateful for the shift in topic. They do, he said, his tone softening. It's the one thing that keeps me sane. With the winery struggling, roses don't care about market prices or county tastings. He managed a thin smile, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the window, where a small shed was visible through the rain, its door slightly ajar. Inside, she glimpsed shelves lined with bottles, not of wine, but of chemicals. Their labels faded but ominous. You must need all sorts of supplies for your roses, she said, her eyes returning to Slade. Pesticides, perhaps. The chemist, Mr. Pie must be a great help. Slade's smile faded, and he set his glass down with a clink. Pie, I buy what I need, same as anyone. Aphids are a devil to manage. His voice was curt, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the shed, as if it held secrets he'd rather keep hidden. She rose, smoothing her shawl, her manner as unassuming as ever. You're quite right, Mr. Slade. Gardening is such a trial sometimes. Thank you for your time. I shan't keep you from your roses. She paused at the door, turning back with a gentle smile. It's a pity about the festival, though. Such a public stage for a tragedy. Almost as if someone wanted to make a point. Slade's face paled, but he said nothing, merely nodding as she stepped into the rain. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, her mind alight with new threads. Slade's bitterness was palpable. His rivalry with Duval, a wound that had festered for years. His vague alibi and the chemicals in his shed were troubling, though not yet proof of guilt. She thought of a village tailor, years ago, whose quiet resentment had led to a series of spiteful acts. Nothing so dire as murder, but driven by the same slow-burning envy. Slade's circumstances were more desperate, his stakes higher. As she walked back to the village, the rain pattering on her umbrella, Miss Marple considered the festival's chaos. A vial of poison slipped into a glass during a moment's distraction could have been the work of a man like Slade, driven by years of humiliation. Yet Evelyn Hart's guardedness and Duval's nervous pride could not be dismissed. And Wren himself, with his knack for making enemies, might have been a convenient target for a larger scheme. She paused by the village green, where children splashed in puddles. Their laughter a stark contrast to her thoughts. The chemist's shop was her next destination, she decided. Mr. Pye, with his knowledge of poisons, might shed light on Slade's purchases, or others. The festival's tragedy was a puzzle of human failings, and Miss Marple's patient mind was already piecing it together, one careful stitch at a time. In St. Mary's Mead, as in all villages, the truth lay buried in the ordinary, waiting for her to unearth it. Chapter 7. A Village Whisper. The rain had softened to a fine drizzle. By the time Miss Jane Marple reached the heart of St. Mary's Mead, where the village square bustled with its usual rhythm, despite the gloom cast by Thomas Wren's death. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps, and the scent of fresh bread wafted from the bakery, mingling with the damp earthiness of the air. Miss Marple, her umbrella tucked under her arm, made her way to the church hall, where a weekly tea was underway. Such gatherings, she knew, were fertile ground for village gossip, and gossip, when sifted with care, could yield clues as vital as any fingerprint. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, a prop that rendered her presence unthreatening, though her mind was as sharp as the needles within. The hall was warm and crowded, its long tables laden with teapots, scones, and plates of sandwiches. Villagers clustered in small groups, their voices a low hum punctuated by bursts of laughter or hushed whispers about the festival's tragedy. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, greeted by nods and smiles from familiar faces. She settled near the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, whose kindly nature was matched by an ear for village talk. But it was Mrs. Price, the postmistress, who caught Miss Marple's attention, her voice rising above the chatter as she held court near the tea-urn. "Oh, it's a scandal, it is," Mrs. Price declared, her eyes gleaming as she addressed a knot of listeners. "Poison, right there in Mr. Duval's wine. Poor man, his reputation in tatters. But I saw something, you know, just before it happened." She paused for effect, relishing the attention, and Miss Marple leaned closer, her needles clicking softly. "What did you see, Mrs. Price?" asked Mrs. Bantry, who had joined the group, her curiosity as keen as ever. Mrs. Price lowered her voice, drawing her audience in. "Victor Slade, that's what. He was near Mr. Duval's stall, not 10 minutes before Mr. Wren took his fatal sip. Had a little bottle in his hand, he did. Thought it was cologne at the time, but now I'm not so sure. He was hovering, looking shifty if you ask me." Her words carried the weight of conviction, and the group murmured in agreement, their imaginations alight with suspicion. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail, A vial, small enough to be mistaken for cologne, could easily hold cyanide. She recalled her visit to Slade's cottage, the chemical bottles in his shed, and his evasive manner. But Mrs. Price's account, while vivid, needed corroboration. Village gossip often embroidered the truth, like a shawl with too many flourishes. "How interesting," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "And you're certain it was Mr.?" "Slade." The meadow was so crowded Mrs. Price bristled slightly, unused to her tales being questioned. "Certain as I'm standing here, Miss Marple. I've known Victor Slade since he was a lad. It was him, plain as day, near the table where the glasses were set out. And he wasn't tasting wine, I'll tell you that." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her thoughts were racing. Slade's presence near the stall, coupled with his raw bitterness toward Duval and Wren, wove a compelling thread, but it was not yet proof. She turned to Mrs. Clement, who was pouring tea with a serene smile. "And you, Mrs. Clement? Did you notice anything unusual at the festival? You're always so observant." Mrs. Clement hesitated, her hand steadying the teapot. "Well, I was helping with the cake stall, so I didn't see much of the wine tasting. But I did notice Miss Hart, Evelyn, that is, looking rather tense. She was checking the glasses over and over, as if something was worrying her. I thought it odd, for she's usually so composed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her face remained serene. Evelyn's guardedness at the village hall seminar took on new significance. A sommelier's attention to detail was expected, but excessive checking suggested unease, or perhaps vigilance. "How thoughtful of her to be so thorough," Miss Marple said. "It must be difficult, managing such an event under scrutiny." Before Mrs. Clement could reply, Mr. Pye, the village chemist, joined the group, his thin frame and spectacles giving him a scholarly air. He was a quiet man, but his shop was a hub of village life, and Miss Marple had long intended to speak with him. "A terrible business," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Cyanide, I hear." "Dreadful stuff. I keep it locked away, of course. For laboratory use, only Miss Marple sees the opening, her voice as gentle as ever. You're so careful, Mr. Pye, but I suppose people do buy such things for their gardens, for pests perhaps." She watched him closely, noting the way his fingers tightened on his cup. "Oh yes," Mr. Pye said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Rat poison, insecticides, they're common enough. I sold some to Mr. Slade not long ago for his roses. Aphids, he said, and to others, of course. Mrs. Bantry for her greenhouse, Mr. Duval for his vineyard sheds. But cyanide, that's not something I'd sell lightly." He paused, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Mind you, it's not impossible to get, if someone knows where to look." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the new information into her tapestry. Slade's purchase of poison, however innocuous its stated purpose, was a thread that could not be ignored. Nor could Duval's, though his use seemed routine for a vintner. She thought of her own garden, where a bottle of pesticide had once been misplaced, only to turn up in the wrong hands. Access to poison was one thing, intent was another. She turned the conversation to lighter matters, complimenting Mrs. Clement's scones and Mr. Pye's knowledge of herbs, but her thoughts remained on the festival. The vial in Slade's hand, Evelyn's tense vigilance, Duval's pride in his untouchable bottles, all pointed to a crime of opportunity, yet one requiring precision. Cyanide as Mr. Pye had implied, was not a casual choice. It demanded planning, a steady hand, and a heart cold enough to act in a crowd. As the tea drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered, helping to stack cups as an excuse to overhear more. A young woman, Miss Finch, who worked at the bakery, mentioned seeing Wren arguing with someone at the festival's edge, though she couldn't say who. He was always arguing, she added with a shrug. Didn't think much of it till now. Miss Marple filed the detail away, wondering if the argument was with Slade, Duval, or another unseen player. She left the hall as dusk settled, the village lights glowing softly through the mist. Her umbrella shielded her from the drizzle, but her mind was unshaded, turning over the whispers she'd gathered. Slade's vial and his shed of chemicals loomed large, but Evelyn's tension and Duval's defensiveness could not be dismissed. Wren's quarrels, too, suggested a web of animosities, any one of which might have led to his glass. She thought of a village seamstress years ago, whose quiet grudge had led to a sabotaged dress. Petty, but revealing of how resentment could simmer until it spilled over. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she neared her cottage, the church clock chiming the hour. She would need to revisit the meadow, she decided, to retrace the moments before Wren's collapse. The table of glasses, the open bottles, the crowd's chaos, all held clues if she could find them. And Mr. Pye's shop warranted a visit to confirm the poisons he'd sold and to whom. The festival's tragedy was a knot of motives, and Miss Marple's patient hands were already teasing it apart, one careful thread at a time. In St. Mary's Mead, the truth was like a buried root, hidden but not beyond reach. Chapter 8. The Tasting Revisited. The meadow where the wine festival had met its tragic end lay quiet under a pale morning sky, the grass still trampled from the crowd's fervour. Miss Jane Marple stood at its edge, her shawl drawn against the autumn chill, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a cartographer mapping uncharted land. The stalls were gone, their cheerful canopies dismantled, but the memory of that fatal day lingered like a stubborn fog. Her knitting bag hung at her side, a familiar prop, though her hands were still, her mind wholly occupied with reconstructing the moments before Thomas Wren's collapse. In St. Mary's Mead, she knew, the truth often hid in plain sight, tucked into the folds of the ordinary, and she meant to find it. She walked slowly toward the spot where Clarence Duval's stall had stood, now marked only by a patch of flattened grass and a few discarded corks. The table, she recalled, had been long and cluttered. Bottles, glasses, napkins, a bowl of almonds for tasting, all arranged under Duval's watchful eye, and Evelyn Hart's deft hands. Somewhere in that bustle, a glass had been poisoned, and Wren had paid the price. Miss Marple's gaze swept the area, noting the proximity of other stalls, the paths where villagers had milled, and the open space where anyone might have slipped close unnoticed. A festival, she mused, was a thief's playground, crowded, chaotic, with eyes distracted by merriment. Inspector Craddock had shared the laboratory's findings the previous evening, his voice heavy with frustration. The broken glass from Wren's hand held traces of cyanide, as did the spilled wine soaking the grass. The bottle itself, Duval's prized Pinot Noir, was clean, suggesting the poison had been added after the pour. "It's devilish," Craddock had said, pacing her cottage parlour. The glass was the key, but how did the poison get there? Evelyn poured it. Duval opened the bottle, and the crowd was everywhere. Anyone could have done it, but no one saw a thing. Miss Marple had nodded, her needles clicking, and suggested he look again at the table's layout. Now, standing in the meadow, she intended to do the same. She pictured the scene. Duval, florid and proud, uncorking bottles with a flourish. Evelyn, her movements precise, filling glasses with practiced grace. Wren, loud and critical, seizing his glass with a sneer. Victor Slade, according to Mrs. Price, had lingered nearby, a vial in his hand. Miss Marple stepped to where the table had stood, imagining its surface. The glasses, Evelyn had insisted, were clean, freshly washed, yet cyanide, as Mr. Pye had implied, was a swift and subtle weapon, requiring only a moment to slip into a glass. She bent low, examining the grass, though she knew the police had scoured it. A faint stain remained where the wine had spilled, its edges blurred by rain. She straightened, her mind turning to the table's clutter. Could a vial have been hidden among the napkins, or dropped into a glass during a distraction? Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps. Dr. Haydock approached, his medical bag in hand, his face etched with concern. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat. "Revisiting the scene, are you?" "I don't blame you. It's a puzzle that keeps me awake." He glanced at the ground, where Wren had fallen. Cyanide's a brutal thing, fast, merciless. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave but curious. "Indeed, Doctor. It's the timing that intrigues me. The poison must have been added just before Mr. Wren drank, or it would have been noticed. That almond-like smell you mentioned, would it be detectable in a glass of wine?" Haydock rubbed his chin, considering. "In a small dose, likely not. Wine's bouquet is strong, especially a Pinot Noir. The cyanide would blend in until it was too late. But it had to be quick. Seconds, not minutes, to avoid suspicion." He shook his head. "The audacity of it, in a crowd like that!" Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. "Seconds," she murmured. "Then it was someone close to the table, someone who could act without drawing eyes." She paused, her gaze drifting to the path where Slade had been seen. "Dr. Haydock, you were near the stall when it happened. Did you notice Mr. Slade, perhaps, or Miss Hart's movements?" Haydock frowned, recalling the moment. "I was at the cheese stall, not far off. I saw Evelyn pouring, of course. She was quick, efficient. Duval was beside her, talking up his wine. Slade, I can't say I noticed him, but the crowd was thick. I only turned when Wren cried out." He sighed. "If I'd been closer, I might have seen something useful." "You've been very helpful," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "Every detail matters, even the absence of one." As Haydock moved off to his rounds, she lingered, her mind reconstructing the tasting. Evelyn had poured, Duval had opened, Slade had hovered. Any of them could have seized a fleeting moment, but motive remained the key. Slade's envy, Evelyn's debts, Duval's pride, all were threads, but none yet formed a complete pattern. She walked the meadow's perimeter, noting the cider stall where Slade claimed to have been. It was a short distance from Duval's table, close enough for a quick approach, far enough to avoid notice. She thought of a village dance, years ago, when a young man had slipped a note into a girl's pocket during a crowded reel, unseen by all but her sharp eyes. Opportunity, she knew, thrived in chaos. Returning to the table's imagined outline, She considered the glasses. Evelyn had been adamant they were clean, but Miss Marple recalled her tension at the seminar, her repeated checks. Was it diligence or fear of discovery? And Slade's vial, glimpsed by Mrs. Price, suggested premeditation. Duval, too, could not be dismissed. His insistence on his bottle's sanctity might hide a deeper fear. She thought of her neighbour, Mr. Finch, whose pride in his dish orchard had blinded him to a thief's pilfering. Pride, she mused, could be as much a weakness as envy. As she left the meadow, the church clock chimed, marking the hour. Miss Marple's steps turned toward the village, her mind set on a plan. A gathering, perhaps, to stir the pot and see what rose to the surface. She would ask Inspector Craddock to arrange it, a small affair at the vicarage, with Duval, Evelyn, and Slade present. A hint of new evidence, carefully dropped, might unsettle the guilty. She recalled a village fete, where a careless remark had exposed a petty grudge. People, in her experience, revealed themselves when pressed, however gently. The meadow faded behind her, its secrets still buried but not beyond reach. Miss Marple's needles would remain in her bag for now, but her mind was stitching together the threads, Slade's vial, Evelyn's tension, Duval's pride, and Wren's myriad enemies. In St. Mary's Mead, the truth was like a weed in a well-tended garden, persistent, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. Chapter 9. A Trap is Set. The vicarage parlour glowed softly in the lamplight, its heavy drapes drawn against the evening's drizzle, creating an intimate cocoon for the small gathering Miss Jane Marple had orchestrated. The room, with its polished oak furniture and faded chintz, exuded the quiet respectability of St. Mary's Mead, though the air tonight was taut with unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm, her eyes as sharp as ever beneath her serene demeanour. She had persuaded Inspector Craddock to arrange this meeting, ostensibly to discuss the festival's aftermath with those closest to the tragedy. But her true purpose was to stir the waters and watch the ripples. In her experience, the guilty often betrayed themselves when pressed, however subtly, and she meant to apply that pressure now. The guests were few but carefully chosen. Clarence Duval, his florid face strained but resolute. Evelyn Hart, her auburn hair impeccable, but her hands betraying a faint tremor. And Victor Slade, his lean frame hunched, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. The vicar, Mr. Clement, and his wife hovered at the edges, offering tea and platitudes, their presence lending a veneer of normalcy to the charged atmosphere. Craddock stood by the door, his notebook discreetly tucked away, his expression one of professional neutrality, though he exchanged a knowing glance with Miss Marple. He trusted her instincts, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, and was ready to follow her lead. Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "It's so kind of you all to come," she said, her needles pausing for effect. "The festival was such a blow to our little community, and poor Mr. Wren's death has left us all shaken. I thought it might help to talk, to clear the air, as it were." She smiled, her eyes moving from face to face, noting Duval's stiff posture, Evelyn's guarded calm, and Slade's barely concealed unease. Duval spoke first, his voice booming despite the small room. "Clear the air. I'd say it's high time. My wine, my reputation slandered by this dreadful business. I assure you, Miss Marple, my bottles were untouchable. Someone else is to blame. and I've a mind to know who his eyes flicked toward Slade, a challenge in their depths. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. Of course, Mr. Duval. Your wines are the pride of St. Mary's Mead. It's unthinkable that anyone could tamper with them under your watch. Though I suppose, in the festival's bustle, a moment's distraction could allow mischief. She let the word hang, her gaze resting lightly on Evelyn. Evelyn's lips tightened, but her voice remained steady. I poured the glasses myself, Miss Marple, as I told the inspector. They were clean, the bottle freshly opened. I saw nothing amiss. Her fingers twisted a napkin in her lap, a small gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Slade, silent until now, shifted, uncomfortably, his chair creaking. "Why are we here, poking at this again?" he muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Wren's dead, and I was nowhere near his glass." I was at the cider stall. As I said, his voice carried a defensive edge, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, despite the room's coolness. Craddock, sensing his cue, stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "We're here because new evidence has come to light," he said, his words carefully chosen at Miss Marple's suggestion. "A witness has come forward, claiming to have seen something unusual near Mr. Duval's stall just before the tasting. Something about a vial, perhaps, or an odd movement." He paused, letting the statement settle, his eyes scanning the room. The effect was immediate. Duval's face reddened, though whether from indignation or fear, Miss Marple could not yet tell. "A vial? Nonsense! My stall was secure," he blustered, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair, betraying tension. Evelyn's composure held, but her fingers stilled, the napkin now a crumpled ball in her lap. Slade, however, reacted most visibly. His head jerked up, his eyes wide with alarm, and he stood abruptly, knocking his teacup to the floor with a clatter. "I've had enough of this," Slade snapped, his voice trembling. "Accusing me without proof. I told you I was at the cider stall. I've nothing to do with this." He moved toward the door, his steps unsteady, muttering excuses about needing air. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her voice calm but piercing. "It's so difficult, isn't it, Mr. Slade, when suspicion falls so close? The festival was such a public stage, almost as if someone wanted to make a spectacle, to ruin not just a man, but a reputation." Her eyes met his, gentle but unrelenting, and she saw the flicker of panic in his gaze before he turned away. Craddock followed Slade out, his departure discreet but purposeful, a signal to Miss Marple that he would keep watch. The room fell silent, the vicar's wife bustling to clean the spilled tea, her nervous chatter filling the void. Duval cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "If there's a witness, Inspector, I demand to know who. My wine was pure, I swear it. This is slander." Evelyn, her voice low, added, "It's true, Inspector." The glasses, the bottle, everything was as it should be. If someone tampered with Wren's glass, it was before I poured or after he took it. Her words were precise, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted toward Duval, as if seeking reassurance. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone as soft as the lamplight. "It's curious, isn't it, how quickly the poison acted? Dr. Haydock said it was cyanide, slipped into the glass just before Mr. Wren drank. A bold act in such a crowd, almost as if the culprit meant to cast blame on the wine itself, to ruin the festival's heart." She paused, her eyes moving between Duval and Evelyn. Or perhaps Mr. Wren was simply the wrong man. At the wrong time, Duval's face darkened, but he said nothing, his fingers drumming on the table. Evelyn's composure wavered, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. The vicar, sensing the tension, suggested more tea, but Miss Marple rose, her shawl gathered about her. "Thank you, Mr. Clement, Mrs. Clement, for your hospitality," she said. "I think we've all given much to ponder tonight. Inspector, perhaps you'll keep us informed of any developments." Craddock nodded, his expression unreadable, though Miss Marple knew he was already planning his next move. As the guests departed, Duval with a curt nod, Evelyn with a strained smile. Miss Marple lingered, exchanging a few words with Mrs. Clement about the parish flower show. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying Slade's panic, Evelyn's hesitation, and Duval's bluster. The trap had been set, and Slade's reaction was the most telling. A man on edge, ready to bolt. She thought of a village boy, years ago, who had fled a confrontation only to betray his guilt in the act. People, she mused, were never so revealing as when they felt the net tightening. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the night air sharp and clear. Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow but steady, her mind weaving the evening's threads into her tapestry. Slade's flight was a clue, but not yet proof. Evelyn's guardedness and Duval's defensiveness suggested secrets, though whether they were of guilt or fear remained unclear. The witness Craddock had mentioned was a fiction, a nudge suggested by Miss Marple to unsettle the guilty. But Mrs. Price's account of Slade's vial was real enough. The chemist, Mr. Pye, might confirm its nature, and the meadow still held secrets to be explored. As she reached her cottage, the village clock tolled, its chimes echoing through the quiet streets. Miss Marple's needles would rest tonight, but her mind would not. The festival's tragedy was a puzzle of human frailties, envy, pride, ambition, and she was close to its heart. In St. Mary's Mead, the truth was like a buried seed, waiting for her patient hands to coax it into the light. Chapter 10. The Confession, the Night Air of St. Mary's Mead carried a sharp bite, as Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her shawl draped over her shoulders, watching the village settle into silence. The gathering at the vicarage had stirred the waters just as she intended, and Victor Slade's abrupt departure had been the most telling ripple. His panic, so palpable in the lamplit parlour, suggested a man teetering on the edge of guilt, though Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. In her experience, fear could stem from many sources. Guilt, yes, but also shame, or the dread of being falsely accused. Her knitting lay untouched on the table, her mind too busy weaving the threads of the Idiagi festival's tragedy to bother with needles. Inspector Craddock's knock came shortly after 9, his face flushed from the cold and his eyes alight with urgency. He stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat, and accepted the cup of tea Miss Marple offered with a nod of gratitude. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair by the fire. Slade bolted from the vicarage straight to his cottage. I followed discreetly, of course. He went to that shed of his, the one you mentioned, and started rummaging like a man possessed. We found a vial, hidden under a sack of fertilizer. Cyanide, I'd wager, though the lab will confirm it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained grave. "A vial," she murmured, her mind recalling Mrs. Price's gossip about Slade's suspicious bottle at the festival. How careless of him to keep it. But then people under strain often make such mistakes. Did he say anything? Craddock nodded, his notebook already open. We confronted him at the cottage. He crumbled like a dry scone, admitted to slipping cyanide into Wren's glass, though he swears he didn't mean to kill. Said he wanted to taint Duval's wine, make a few people ill, ruin the festival and Duval's reputation. Wren, he claims, was an accident, just the first to drink from the poisoned glass. Craddock's voice carried a mix of triumph and disbelief. He's in custody now, babbling about Duval stealing his life's work, how he couldn't stand seeing him lauded while his own winery failed. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turning over Slade's confession. It fit the pattern she'd seen forming, his bitter envy, his skulking near the stall, the vial glimpsed by Mrs. Price. Yet something nagged at her, a loose thread in the tapestry. He meant to sicken, not kill, she said softly. That's interesting, isn't it? Cyanide is such a final choice for a mere scandal. And Mr. Wren, poor man, was so conveniently placed to take the fatal sip. Craddock leaned forward, his brow furrowed. You think he's lying? Protecting someone, perhaps? Not lying, perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her voice as gentle as the fire's crackle. But not telling the whole truth. People like Mr. Slade, driven by years of resentment, act impulsively, but they also guard their motives. I wonder if he truly meant only to sicken, or if Mr. Wren's death served a purpose he's not admitting. She paused, her eyes distant. I recall a village lad, years ago, who confessed to stealing apples, but hid that he'd done it to spite a rival. Mr. Slade's envy of Mr. Duval is clear, but his choice of Mr. Wren's glass, that feels personal. Craddock scribbled a note, his respect for her insight evident. We'll question him further. The vial's a strong link, and his presence near the stall matches Mrs. Price's account. But you're right, it's too neat. Why Wren? And how did he know which glass Wren would take? Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Exactly, Inspector. The festival was chaotic, but the poison was precise. Mr. Slade would have needed a moment, a clear opportunity. Miss Hart poured the glasses, and Mr. Duval was close by. Either could have noticed something unless they were distracted, or complicit. She set her cup down, her mind replaying the vicarage gathering. Evelyn's crumpled napkin, Duval's bluster, Slade's panic. Craddock rose, his expression determined. I'll have the constables search Slade's shed again, and we'll press him on the details. If he's hiding something, we'll find it. But Miss Marple, without your nudge at the vicarage, he might not have run straight to that vial. You've a knack for this. Miss Marple smiled, her hands folding neatly in her lap. I only watch, Inspector, and listen. People are much the same in St. Mary's Mead or anywhere. They carry their secrets, but they cannot help revealing them, given time. She paused, her eyes sharpening. You might ask Mr. Slade about his argument with Mr. Wren at the harvest fair. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it. Something about Wren mocking his wine. It may be nothing, but small slights can fester. Craddock nodded, pocketing his notebook. I'll do that. And I'll check on Miss Hart and Mr. Duval again. If Slade's telling the truth, someone might have seen him near the glass. If not, he trailed off, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. As Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her window, the village now cloaked in darkness. Slade's confession was a breakthrough, but it did not close the book. The festival's tragedy had layers, like the sediment in a fine wine, and she sensed more beneath the surface. Evelyn's tension, Duval's defensiveness, even Wren's own quarrels, each held a piece of the truth. She thought of a village widow, long ago, who had confessed to a minor theft but concealed a deeper betrayal. Slade's story rang true, but only partly so. She settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched, her mind tracing the festival's moments. Slade, with his vial, could have slipped cyanide into a glass during the crowd's distraction. But why Wren's? Had he known Wren would take it, or was it chance, as he claimed? And what of Evelyn, who poured the wine, or Duval, who swore his bottles were untouchable? The meadow, the table, the glasses, all held clues, and Miss Marple resolved to revisit them in her mind, if not in person. The church clock chimed 10, its notes echoing through the quiet village. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the chemist, Mr. Pye, whose mention of selling poison to Slade and others lingered like a shadow. A visit to his shop might clarify matters, though she suspected the truth lay not in chemicals, but in human hearts. Envy, pride, revenge. Slade's confession was a step, but the path to the full truth wound deeper still. In St. Mary's Mead, as in all villages, secrets were like roots beneath the soil, hidden but not beyond her patient reach. Chapter 11. The Loose Ends. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary's Mead, casting a tentative light on the village as it stirred from the shadow of the festival's tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small parlour, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. Victor Slade's confession had unravelled a significant thread in the tapestry of Thomas Wren's murder, but Miss Marple knew that a single confession, however damning, rarely told the whole story. In her experience, the truth was like a garden after a storm, tangled with stray roots and broken stems that needed careful tending to reveal the full picture. There were loose ends to tie up, and she meant to see them neatly knotted. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after breakfast, his face weary but resolute, carrying the weight of a case nearly closed. He settled into the armchair opposite Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea with a grateful nod. "Slade's sticking to his story," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Says he slipped the cyanide into Wren's glass to sicken a few people, ruin Duval's wine, and disgrace the festival. He swears he didn't mean to kill, but the lab confirmed the vial in his shed was cyanide, enough to do the job. We've got him dead to rights, but—" He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't think it's the whole truth, do you?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression serene but thoughtful. "It's a convincing story, Inspector, and Mr. Slade's envy of Mr. Duval is clear as day. But I wonder why Mr. Wren was the one to suffer. If the goal was to taint the wine, why not poison several glasses? And cyanide, as you know, is not a gentle choice for a mere scandal." She sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "I recall a village girl, years ago, who admitted to spreading gossip, but hid that she'd done it to shield a friend. Mr. Slade's confession feels incomplete, as if he's protecting something or someone." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "You think he had an accomplice? Or that he's covering for another motive?" Not necessarily an accomplice, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but precise. But motive is a slippery thing. Let us consider the others, Miss Hart and Mr. Duval. They were closest to the glass, after all. I've been thinking about Miss Hart's tension at the festival and the vicarage, and Mr. Duval's insistence on his untouchable bottles. Each has a shadow. However faint, Craddock nodded, scribbling a note. I've questioned them again. Evelyn Hart's story hasn't changed. She poured the wine, checked the glasses, saw nothing amiss. But she's nervous, keeps glancing at Duval when we talk. As for Duval, he's still blustering about his reputation, but I caught him out on a detail. He admitted the crates of wine were left unattended for a few minutes while he greeted the mayor. Not long, but enough for someone to tamper if they were quick. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. A few minutes, she murmured. In a crowded meadow, that's an eternity for a clever hand. And Miss Hart, her nerves suggest more than shock. Perhaps she saw something she hasn't told, or fears being implicated. She paused, her needles resuming their rhythm. I think it's time to clarify their stories, Inspector. And Mr. Pye, the chemist, his mention of selling poison to both Slade and Duval is worth revisiting. Craddock agreed, and they arranged to meet Evelyn and Duval separately that afternoon, with a stop at Mr. Pye's shop to confirm his records. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took a short walk to the village square, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind sifting through the case's remaining threads. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Pye greeted her with his usual scholarly air, his spectacles glinting as he sorted bottles behind the counter. Miss Marple, he said, I heard about Slade's arrest. Shocking, isn't it? I never thought he'd go so far, though he was always a bitter sort. He shook his head, setting a jar of powder aside. Quite shocking, Miss Marple agreed, her tone gentle. You mentioned selling him poison for his roses, I believe. And to Mr. Duval as well. Do you keep records of such sales? It would help the inspector, I'm sure. Mr. Pye nodded, retrieving a ledger from a drawer. I'm meticulous about it, he said, flipping through pages. Here, Slade bought a small quantity of rat poison, arsenic-based, 3 weeks ago, and Duval a similar amount for his vineyard sheds about a month back. But cyanide? I don't stock it for general sale. It's too dangerous. If Slade got it, it wasn't from me. His voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he feared his shop's role in the scandal. Thank you, Mr. Pye, she said, her smile disarming. You've been most helpful. As she left, her mind turned over the ledger's details. Arsenic, not cyanide, had been sold, but cyanide was not impossible to obtain, as Pye had admitted at the church tea. Slade's shed, with its chemical bottles, suggested he had sources beyond the village chemist. But Duval's purchase intrigued her. A vintner with pests might buy poison, but his nervous tick at her visit hinted at more than routine pest control. At the vicarage, where Craddock had arranged to meet Evelyn, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting a soft presence. Evelyn arrived, her auburn hair neatly pinned, but her hands betrayed her unease, twisting a handkerchief as she spoke. I've told you everything, Inspector, she said, her voice steady but strained. I poured the wine, the glasses were clean, and I handed one to Mr. Wren. I didn't. See anyone near the table who shouldn't have been Miss Marple, tilted her head, her voice gentle. You were so busy, Miss Hart, with all those glasses to manage. It must have been overwhelming. I noticed you checking them carefully, as Mrs. Clement mentioned. Were you worried about something specific? Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she held her composure. Only about doing my job well, she said. Mr. Duval's wine is important, and I wanted everything perfect. There was no poison in my hands, I swear it. Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught the way her gaze darted to the door, as if expecting interruption. Craddock pressed further, his tone calm but insistent. Miss Hart, you were close to Mr. Duval during the tasting. Did you see Mr. Slade near the stall, or anyone else acting oddly? Evelyn hesitated, her handkerchief now a tight knot. I saw Slade earlier, near the cider stall, but not at the table. It was so crowded, Inspector. I was focused on the pouring. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the strain, as if she were holding back a truth too heavy to share. Duval's interview, held at his vineyard, was less revealing. He reiterated his story, sealed bottles, vigilant oversight, a moment's lapse with the mayor. But his bluster had softened into weariness. I've lost customers already, he admitted, his face drawn. If Slade did this, he's ruined me. But I swear my wine was pure. Miss Marple asked about the land dispute with Wren, and Duval's eyes flashed. He was a nuisance, but I'd no reason to kill him. My fight was with Slade's envy, not Wren's nonsense. As they left the vineyard, Craddock confided in Miss Marple. Evelyn's hiding something, I'm sure of it. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. And Duval, his story holds. But that lapse with the crates bothers me. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning. Evelyn's tension suggested knowledge, perhaps of Slade's actions, or fear of being implicated. Duval's lapse was a crack in his armour, but not proof of murder. Slade's confession, while damning, left questions. Why Wren, and why so precise a poison? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The loose ends were few now. Evelyn's fear, Duval's lapse, and Slade's partial truth. She thought of a village seamstress long ago, who had hidden her lover's crime out of loyalty. Evelyn's glances at Duval. Duval's trust in his process. Slade's desperate act. All pointed to a crime born of envy, but perhaps shaped by other hands. The truth, she knew, was close, like a bud ready to bloom in Saint. Mary's Mead's Quiet Garden. Chapter 12. The Festival's End. The week following Victor Slade's arrest brought a tentative calm to Saint. Mary's Mead, as if the village had exhaled a breath it had held since Thomas Wren's collapse. The meadow, once a stage for tragedy, bloomed anew with preparations for a resumed wine festival, its organizers determined to restore the village's spirit. The stalls were re-erected, their canopies bright against the autumn sky, and the air carried the familiar tang of grapes and anticipation. Miss Jane Marple sat on her usual bench near the vicarage, her knitting complete, a soft scarf folded neatly in her basket, her eyes scanning the revived festivities with a quiet satisfaction. The truth had been uncovered, but her work, she knew, was never truly done. Human nature, with its tangle of passions and frailties, always bore watching. Clarence Duval's stall stood at the meadow's heart once more, its bottles gleaming under the sun, though his usual flamboyance was tempered by the weight of recent events. The laboratory had cleared his Pinot Noir, confirming that the cyanide had been added to Wren's glass alone, not the bottle, and his reputation, though bruised, was on the mend. He poured samples with a steady hand, his smile more genuine than it had been in days, though Miss Marple noted a new humility in his demeanour, a lesson, perhaps, in the fragility of pride. Evelyn Hart moved among the crowd, her auburn hair catching the light as she guided tasters with her expert knowledge. Her composure had returned, but Miss Marple saw a softness in her eyes, as if the ordeal had lifted a burden she had carried in silence. The village buzzed with talk of Slade's confession, now fleshed out under Inspector Craddock's relentless questioning. He had admitted to slipping cyanide into Wren's glass, driven by a festering envy of Duval's success and a desire to ruin the festival's centrepiece. Wren's death, he insisted, was an accident. A miscalculation of the dose meant only to sicken. Yet Miss Marple, in her final conversation with Craddock, had suggested a deeper motive. Slade's choice of Wren's glass, she posited, was no mere chance. Wren's public mockery of Slade's wine at the harvest fair, coupled with his investment in Duval's vineyard, had made him a symbol of Slade's failures. The poison was meant to disgrace Duval, but Wren's death had served as a bitter bonus, a personal revenge cloaked in a larger scheme. Evelyn's tension, Miss Marple had concluded, stemmed not from guilt, but from suspicion. She had seen Slade lingering near the stall, his vial glinting in the sunlight, but fear of scandal and her own precarious finances had kept her silent. When pressed by Craddock, she admitted to noticing Slade's odd behaviour, but swore she had not connected it to the poisoning until later. Her loyalty to Duval, whose patronage supported her career, had made her wary of speaking out, lest she be drawn into the mire. Duval's lapse with the crates, meanwhile, was just that, a lapse born of pride and distraction, not malice. His nervous tic, Miss Marple surmised, came from a minor tax irregularity he feared might surface under scrutiny, a secret unrelated to the murder, but enough to make him jittery. Craddock had visited Miss Marple's cottage the previous evening, his notebook finally closed, his relief palpable. "You saw it all, didn't you?" he said, a wry smile on his lips. "Slade's motive, Evelyn's silence, Duval's bluster. You unpicked it like one of your scarves. I'd have been chasing shadows without you." Miss Marple had smiled, her hands folded in her lap. "People are much the same, Inspector, whether in St. Mary's Mead or a grand city. They wear their hearts on their sleeves, if you know where to look." Mr. Slade's envy was a fire that burned too bright, and poor Mr. Wren was caught in its flames. She had paused, her eyes twinkling faintly. "But do keep an eye on Miss Hart. She's learned a lesson, I think, but ambition can be a tricky path." Now, as the festival unfolded, Miss Marple watched Evelyn pour a glass for a young couple, her voice bright as she described the wine's notes. Duval, nearby, raised a glass in a toast to the village, his voice carrying a note of gratitude. The crowd responded with applause, a sign that St. Mary's Mead was ready to heal. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the spot where Wren had fallen, now covered with fresh grass, as if the meadow itself sought to erase the memory. She thought of a village wedding years ago, where a bitter guest had spilled wine on the bride's dress, a petty act born of envy. Slade's crime was far graver, but its roots were the same, human failings laid bare under pressure. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Miss Marple rose from her bench, her basket tucked under her arm. The festival would go on. its spirit resilient, but she knew the village would carry the scar of Wren's death, just as it carried the scars of countless small dramas she had witnessed over the years. She walked home, her steps steady, her mind already turning to the next puzzle life might bring. In St. Mary's Mead, the truth was like a well-tended garden, ever growing, ever revealing, and always in need of a watchful eye.